Back in the dust and glare of the late 1880s, when the territory still felt vast and untamed, and the lines between settled land and wild country were drawn not just by fences but by suspicion, there lived a woman called Sahara. She belonged to the Apache people, though her life held her apart from many of her kin. Not by choice, entirely, but by circumstance and the quiet, heavy weight of years. She lived near the edge of the reservation lands, in a small, sturdy wickiup she had built herself, closer to the stark, sun-baked mesas than the clusters of other lodges. The land here was unforgiving, etched with dry washes and studded with cholla and prickly pear. It demanded respect and offered little comfort freely. Sahara knew it intimately. Her hands, though marked by sun and toil, moved with a practiced grace, gathering herbs that held forgotten remedies, tracking the scarce water sources, reading the signs the wind wrote in the sand. Sahara was, perhaps, 36 cycles of the moon, maybe 37. By the measure of some in her community, especially the older women who clung to tradition like a shield against the changing world, she had passed the time for first marriage. She had never married. There had been possibilities once, quiet glances from young men, but life had intervened. A sickness had claimed her parents and a younger sister when she was still a girl on the cusp of womanhood, leaving her alone, the responsibilities falling on her shoulders like stones. Then the world had shifted under the feet of her people, the wars, the forced moves, the shrinking lands. There had been no space for courtship, for building a future when the present was so precarious. Now, the quiet murmurings followed her like the dust devils on the plain. Too old, they whispered. Her path was meant to be another way. The spirits did not bless her with a husband or children when she was young. The words were not always cruel, but they were laced with a quiet finality, a resignation that she had missed her chance, that her life would be one of solitary independence, valued for her knowledge of the land and her skills, but not for the warmth of a family fire. Sahara heard the whispers, felt the distance they created. It settled deep inside her, a cold, still place. Grief was an old companion, a familiar weight she carried in her chest. The loss of her family, the loss of the life she might have had, the loss of belonging fully even amongst her own people. She filled her days with tasks, with the rhythm of the sun and the stars, with the silent company of the wind. She was resilient, yes, the land demanded it, but the resilience was a shield, not a source of warmth. Loneliness was a constant, quiet hum beneath the surface of her solitude. Her life was a pattern, worn smooth by repetition and resignation. Miles away, across land that shimmered like a mirage in the heat, lived Caleb. He was 42 years old, a cowboy whose hands had long since lost the supple youth of his 20s, becoming calloused and strong, marked by rope burns and splinters. He wasn't a ranch owner of any size, just a man trying to scratch a living out of a small claim, a ramshackle cabin, and a few head of scrawny cattle. He'd drifted for years after the war, carrying scars that weren't all visible, trying to outrun memories that clung to him like the desert dust. Caleb was quiet to a fault, his face weathered into a landscape of its own, lines etched around his eyes from squinting into the sun and, perhaps, from sorrows he kept buried deep. He had known women, known companionship in passing, but nothing had ever taken root. He wasn't built for the easy sociability of towns or the complexities of settling down, not with the ghosts that rode his trail. He worked from sunup to sundown, his only companions the stubborn cattle, his weary horse, and the vast indifferent sky. Like Sahara, Caleb's life was defined by solitude, a self-imposed exile born of a weariness with the world and a quiet understanding that he didn't quite fit anywhere. He wasn't seeking anything, not really, just trying to exist, to make his small corner of the world manageable, to keep the past at bay through sheer physical exhaustion. His days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of chores and silence, punctuated only by the lowing of the herd or the distant howl of a coyote. He carried his own form of grief, a silent acknowledgement of paths not taken, lives lost, a future he no longer believed was possible for a man like him. He was resigned, stoic, and alone. The land stretched between them, harsh and beautiful, a fitting stage for lives lived on the edge, isolated by circumstance and choice. It held its breath under the relentless sun, waiting. It happened near the dry wash, a place where the earth had split open like a wound, revealing layers of time in its steep banks. Caleb was checking a fence line, a routine task in a routine day, when he saw a disturbance, a flicker of movement that wasn't animal. His hand went instinctively to the rifle in his saddle sheath. This land wasn't safe for anyone traveling alone, much less someone who appeared to be injured. He approached cautiously, the dry earth crunching under his boots. The figure was huddled against the side of the wash, partially concealed by scrub brush. As he got closer, his breath hitched. It was an Apache woman. His mind immediately flashed with warnings: the nearby town, their simmering resentment of anyone different, doubly so for the native people whose land they now occupied. To be found helping one. It wasn't just unpopular, it could be dangerous. But she was hurt, badly. A deep, ragged cut marred her leg, bleeding sluggishly into the dust. Her clothes were torn, her face pale under the tan, etched with pain. Her eyes, dark and sharp even in her weakened state, met his with a flicker of fear and defiance. Sahara. He knew her by sight, though they had never spoken. The quiet woman who lived alone near the mesas. He stayed mounted for a moment, the sun beating down, the silence pressing in. He could turn back, ride away, pretend he never saw her. It would be the safest thing, the sensible thing. But the raw vulnerability in her eyes, the stark reality of the wound, cut through his weariness, through the layers of self-preservation he had built over the years. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, meant to convey non-aggression. "Easy," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm not gonna hurt you." Sahara watched him, her gaze intense, assessing. She didn't speak, didn't move, except for the slight tremble in her hands pressed against the earth. She was trapped, injured, and facing a white man, a representative of the people who had taken so much. Her instinct was to flee, to fight, but her body refused. "That cut needs tending," Caleb said, nodding towards her leg. "Can you ride?" She shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. The pain was a hot, throbbing fire. She had been running, trying to escape something or someone. She wasn't sure which, only that danger had felt close behind. She had fallen, twisted her leg, and the cut, likely from sharp rock, had opened. Now this man. Caleb knelt a few feet away, careful not to crowd her. "My place isn't far, you can rest there, get that cleaned up." He gestured vaguely back the way he'd come. His cabin was sparse, lonely, but it was shelter. It offered a measure of safety from whatever she was escaping, and from the elements. It was a problem he hadn't sought, a disruption to his carefully maintained solitude, but he couldn't leave her. The simple, undeniable need in front of him was a force he couldn't ignore. Her eyes searched his face, for deception, for malice, for something she could read. She saw weariness, caution, but also a quiet steadiness, a lack of the usual bluster or cruelty she had sometimes seen in men from the town. Slowly, reluctantly, she nodded. Getting her onto his horse was a difficult, painful process. Her leg was swollen, and the cut deep. Caleb worked with a quiet competence, his movements gentle but firm as he supported her weight, trying not to aggravate the injury. She grit her teeth, swallowing back cries of pain, her pride warring with her physical weakness. Finally, she was draped awkwardly across the saddle, Caleb leading the horse slowly back towards his cabin, a small, unlikely procession against the vast backdrop of the silent land. Her presence was a disruption, a challenge, a potential danger. It forced him out of the quiet resignation of his days and presented him with an immediate, undeniable responsibility. His life had changed in the space of a single discovery in a dry wash. The cabin was small, made of rough-hewn logs, smelling faintly of old wood smoke and dust. Inside it was Spartan, a narrow cot, a table, a chair, a small cast-iron stove, shelves with meager supplies. Caleb helped Sahara inside, easing her onto the cot near the stove. She was stiff with pain and mistrust, her body coiled like a wild animal ready to spring despite its injuries. Communication was minimal at first. Caleb fetched water from his well, heated some on the stove. He rummaged in a small tin and produced some clean rags and a bottle of whiskey he kept for emergencies. He knelt by her leg, his face grim as he examined the wound. It was dirty, jagged. Infection was a real risk out here. "Gonna hurt," he warned, his gaze meeting hers briefly before focusing on the wound. He poured a generous amount of whiskey over the cut. Sahara gasped, a sharp intake of air, her hands clenching the rough wool blanket on the cot. She didn't cry out, though her body tensed, sweat beading on her forehead. Her silence was a form of defiance, a refusal to show weakness. He cleaned the wound carefully, gently, his large hands surprisingly deft. He bound it tightly with clean strips of cloth. All the while, their only exchange was functional, necessary. Drink some water. Need more light? Can you move it? Short questions, brief nods or shakes of the head. The silence between them was thick, not empty, but filled with unspoken questions, cautious observation, and the raw, vibrating tension of two strangers bound by circumstance in a confined space. Sahara watched him from under lowered lids. She saw the weary lines on his face, the careful way he handled her leg, the lack of cruelty in his eyes. He wasn't like the men in town who sometimes rode out, swaggering and full of bluster. He was quiet, contained, but he was still a white man. She had learned over many years that kindness from them was often fleeting or had a hidden cost. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Caleb in turn watched her. He saw her resilience, her fierce self-possession even in pain. He saw the intelligence in her dark eyes, the way she observed everything, missed nothing. She was wary, yes, like a hawk on a fence post, ready to take flight at the slightest disturbance. He understood that wariness. He felt it himself, a constant companion born of a lifetime of expecting the worst. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask why she was injured or what she was running from. Those questions felt too intrusive, too soon. He focused on the practicalities, keeping her safe, making sure the wound didn't fester, ensuring she had food and water. Their interaction was one of basic human need and reluctant provision, a silent truce forged in the shared necessity of survival. The days blurred into a slow rhythm dictated by the healing process. Sahara's fever spiked, and Caleb sat with her, sponging her forehead, giving her water. He brewed bitter tea from herbs he knew for fever, though he suspected her knowledge of such things far surpassed his own. When the fever broke, leaving her weak but clearer, she began to stir restlessly. "I can help," she murmured one morning, her voice raspy. It was the most she had said since arriving. Caleb looked up from mending a saddle strap. "Rest is the best help for now." She shook her head slightly. "Your fence, it needs work. I saw as you brought me. And the garden patch. The soil is tired." He hesitated. Her offer was unexpected. He was used to doing everything himself, but the fence did need work, more than he could get to alone, and his small garden struggled every year against the poor soil. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not just as an injured person or a source of potential trouble, but as someone with skills, with observations. "All right," he said finally. "When you're strong enough, but no rushing it." Slowly, carefully, Sahara began to move. First, hobbling outside on a makeshift crutch Caleb fashioned for her. She sat in the shade of the cabin, observing the land around them with an intense, knowing gaze. She pointed out plants he had ignored, telling him in her quiet, careful English what they were used for: medicine, food, dye. She showed him where the windbreak was weakest, where erosion was a threat. As she grew stronger, she insisted on doing small tasks. She weeded the struggling garden patch with a surprising ferocity, her fingers digging into the dry earth. She showed him how to mix ash into the soil, explaining it would replenish it. He watched her, fascinated by her connection to the land, a connection that went far deeper than his own practical efforts to tame it. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in fiery oranges and purples, they sat outside the cabin, sharing a meal of beans and salt pork. The silence was different now, less tense, more comfortable. "My leg is healing," she said, breaking the quiet. "I should go soon." The words hung in the air. Caleb felt a strange, unexpected pang. The routine of her presence, the quiet understanding that had grown between them without many words, had settled into him. He hadn't realized how much her company had begun to feel like a balm. "Where would you go?" he asked, his voice low. "Back to the reservation?" She looked out at the horizon. "My place is there. But," she trailed off. The silence spoke volumes, of the whispers, the isolation she faced even among her own. He nodded, understanding. "You can stay longer," he offered, "until you're fully healed. No need to rush into trouble, if that's what you were leaving." She looked at him then, her dark eyes steady. "Trouble finds me," she said simply. "Being who I am, being alone." That was the closest she had come to explaining. Alone, he knew that feeling. It was a language they both understood, spoken in the quiet spaces between them. He saw her not as an Apache woman, not as a problem, but as another soul navigating the relentless solitude of this world. He saw her strength, her quiet dignity, her deep well of knowledge. He saw past the judgments that others might place on her, the labels of outsider or too old. He simply saw Sahara. And perhaps she was beginning to see Caleb, the quiet man behind the weathered face, the unexpected kindness in his rough hands. Their shared experiences, born of necessity, were weaving a new pattern onto the worn fabric of their solitary lives. They weren't just coexisting, they were relying on each other, learning from each other, finding a quiet comfort in the shared rhythm of their days. The walls they had built around themselves, stone by stone, were beginning to show cracks, letting in the hesitant, fragile light of connection. The fragile peace they had found was not destined to last. The outside world, with its prejudices and fears, pressed in on their small, isolated haven. Word carried on the wind, or perhaps by a passing rider who had spotted smoke from Caleb's chimney and seen a figure that wasn't his, reached the nearby town. Rumors, like wildfire, spread quickly through the dusty streets. Caleb was harboring an Apache woman. The reaction was swift and ugly. The town, small and struggling, clung to its fears and resentments like a drowning man to driftwood. The Apache people were seen as a threat, as others, as less than. Any association with them was viewed with deep suspicion, especially by men like Brody, the self-appointed moral compass and loudest voice in the town saloon. Brody had lost a brother in a skirmish years ago, and nursed a bitter hatred that colored his every word and action concerning the native population. One afternoon, as Caleb and Sahara were working near the corral, mending a broken rail, 3 riders approached the cabin. Brody was at the front, flanked by 2 other men from town, their faces set in grim, self-righteous expressions. They pulled their horses to a stop, a respectful distance away, but their postures were aggressive, hands resting near rifle butts. Caleb straightened, dropping the hammer. Sahara moved instinctively closer to the cabin wall, her body language shifting back to the wary alertness of a cornered animal. The air crackled with unspoken tension. "Calloway," Brody yelled, using Caleb's last name, a name Caleb rarely heard spoken. "We need a word." Caleb walked slowly towards them, wiping his hands on his trousers. He stopped several yards away, forcing Brody to raise his voice if he wanted to be heard. "Afternoon, Brody. What is it?" "We hear you got company out here," Brody said, his eyes darting towards the cabin where Sahara stood, partially visible in the shadow. His voice was laced with accusation. "Got an injured traveler," Caleb replied evenly. "Woman needed help, I gave it." Brody scoffed. "An injured traveler? We hear it's an Apache woman, one of them." He spat the word out as if it tasted foul. "Ain't right, Calloway. Having one of them this close to town, too dangerous." "She's not dangerous," Caleb said, his voice tightening. "She's hurt, healing." "Don't matter," Brody sneered. "This is our land now. We don't want no Apache living among us. Get rid of her." Sahara stepped fully into view then, standing tall despite her still healing leg, her gaze level and unwavering as she looked at the men on horseback. Her presence seemed to fuel Brody's anger. "See," Brody exclaimed, gesturing wildly. "Defiant one, ain't she? Probably a spy. Or worse. You don't know what they're capable of, Calloway. Get her gone. By tomorrow, or we'll come back and do it for you." The threat hung heavy in the hot, still air. Caleb felt a cold knot form in his stomach, quickly replaced by a heat he hadn't felt in years, protective anger. They weren't just threatening him, they were threatening Sahara, threatening the quiet, fragile connection they had found. "She's staying," Caleb said, his voice low but firm, leaving no room for argument. "She's not harming anyone. This is my land. You got no right to tell me who can be on it." Brody's face darkened. "We got every right when it's about the safety of the town." "You're making a mistake, Calloway, a big one. You got till sunrise tomorrow." With a final hostile glare, Brody reined his horse around and spurred it, his companions following suit. They rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving Caleb and Sahara standing in the silence, the threat hanging heavy between them. Sahara walked slowly to Caleb's side. "They will come back," she stated, not a question. "Aye," Caleb agreed, his gaze fixed on the disappearing riders. "They will." The conflict had escalated. It was no longer just about an injured woman needing shelter. It was about prejudice, ownership, and a challenge to Caleb's quiet independence. It forced them to confront the reality of their situation, the danger their shared presence invited. It was a test of the tentative trust they had built, forcing them to choose, stand together against the storm, or retreat into their separate isolations. Neither spoke of parting. The choice, in that moment, felt already made. The stakes had been raised, pushing their hesitant connection toward something deeper, forged in the face of external threat. Night fell like a heavy blanket over the land. Inside the cabin, the single lamp cast long, dancing shadows. Caleb checked his rifle, cleaned his pistol. Sahara watched him, her expression unreadable. "You should leave," she said finally, her voice quiet. "This is my trouble. They target me." Caleb looked up from the rifle. "They target you because you're here. On my land. I gave you shelter. Now they've made it my trouble too." He met her gaze. "And even if they hadn't," he added, his voice softer, "I wouldn't let them just take you, run you off." Her eyes searched his, and in the depths of their silence she saw the truth of his words. It wasn't just obligation anymore, it was something else, something new and unexpected. "I know this land," Sahara said, shifting the topic, her mind already turning to the problem at hand. "Better than they do. If they come in the dark, they will follow the road or the wash. They are predictable." Caleb nodded, listening intently. Her knowledge was practical, invaluable. He had the weapons, the willingness to fight, but she had the understanding of the terrain, the experience of moving unseen. They spent the rest of the night talking, planning. Not like strangers anymore, but like partners facing a shared threat. She described the contours of the land around the cabin, the blind spots, the places where a small group could approach unseen, and the places where they would be exposed. He listened, his admiration for her knowledge growing with each word. They were a team, an unlikely one, but effective. The climactic confrontation arrived not at sunrise, as Brody had threatened, but in the pre-dawn darkness, just as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky. Brody and his men, perhaps emboldened by darkness and their own numbers, chose the element of surprise. But Caleb and Sahara were ready. They had moved the horses away from the cabin, extinguished the lamp early, and taken positions based on Sahara's understanding of their likely approach. Caleb was near the front door, rifle in hand, while Sahara was positioned near the back, closer to the wash, blending into the shadows. They heard them first, the creak of saddle leather, the muffled thud of hooves on soft earth. 3 riders, just as Brody had arrived the day before. They dismounted quietly some distance from the cabin and began to advance on foot, spreading out slightly. Caleb waited, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He could make out their shapes in the gloom. They were moving cautiously, expecting them to be asleep or caught unaware. When they were close enough to the cabin, about 20 yards out, Caleb rose from his crouch in the doorway, the rifle raised. "Hold it right there," he yelled, his voice cutting through the stillness. "I told you she was staying." The figures froze. Brody's voice, thick with surprise and anger, answered, "Calloway, you fool, we told you to get rid of her." "She's not going anywhere," Caleb replied, his stance wide, rooted to the ground. He was a wall protecting his home, and the woman within it. "Then you'll go with her," Brody roared, and lifted his own rifle. Before Brody could level his weapon, a movement flickered from the shadows near the back of the cabin. Sahara, silent as a ghost, had circled around, using the terrain as cover. She wasn't armed with a gun, but with a long, sturdy length of dried wood she had found, one end sharp from a break. She sprang from her hiding place not at the men, but at their horses tied loosely together. With swift, brutal efficiency, she struck the lead horse sharply across the flank. The startled animal reared with a loud whinny, pulling against the rope, tangling the other horses and creating instant chaos and noise. It was the diversion Caleb needed. As the men were momentarily distracted, trying to calm their spooked mounts, Caleb fired a single shot from his rifle, aiming deliberately high, into the air above them. The loud report echoed like thunder in the pre-dawn quiet, a sound that carried for miles. It wasn't meant to hit anyone, but to signal, to alarm, and to throw them off balance. "Get out," Caleb bellowed, levering another round into his rifle. "Get out and don't come back. The next one won't be high." Brody and his men were caught between the spooked horses and Caleb's clear threat. The noise, the unexpectedness of Sahara's action, the chilling finality in Caleb's voice, it broke their nerve. They were bullies, not hardened fighters, and the situation had turned against them. "This ain't over, Calloway," Brody shouted, scrambling towards his horse. "For tonight it is," Caleb said grimly. "And you come back, you'll find out it's over for good." Muttering curses and struggling with their tangled horses, the three men managed to remount, their earlier bravado replaced by a panicked desire to escape. They rode off quickly, heading back towards the town, leaving only the dust and the lingering smell of fear. Caleb stayed put, rifle still raised, until the sounds of their retreat had faded completely. Then, he lowered the weapon, his hands trembling slightly with the adrenaline. He looked towards the back of the cabin. Sahara emerged from the shadows, her face grim, her dark eyes reflecting the first pale light of dawn. She didn't say anything, just walked towards him, favoring her healing leg. When she reached him, she stopped, looking up at his face. He looked down at hers. In the dim light, he saw not just resilience, but something softer, something vulnerable. "You stayed," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You didn't run," he replied. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet affirmation of their choice. They had faced the threat together. They had defended their small piece of ground, and more importantly, they had defended each other. The external conflict, harsh and ugly as it was, had served to solidify their bond, revealing its unexpected strength. The climax wasn't a victory over external foes, but a declaration of their unity, a turning point that marked the end of their individual isolation and the beginning of a shared path. The dust settled slowly after Brody and his companions rode away, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the usual quiet of the land. It was a silence weighted with the knowledge of the night's confrontation, but also a silence filled with a strange, fragile peace. They had faced the storm, and they had not broken. Caleb lowered his rifle and walked over to Sahara. Her expression was still serious, but the hard edge of wariness had softened. He reached out a hand, hesitant, and gently touched her arm. You were brave," he said, the words feeling inadequate. A faint smile touched her lips, a rare sight. "You were ready," she responded. In that simple exchange, in the quiet touch, was the culmination of weeks of shared silence, of cautious observation, of small kindnesses and growing reliance. The mistrust that had initially separated them had been replaced by something solid, something earned, mutual respect, deep understanding, and a burgeoning affection that had bloomed unexpectedly in the harsh soil of their solitude. They spent the morning assessing the damage, checking the horses, reinforcing their defenses. But their movements now were different. There was an ease between them, a comfortable proximity that hadn't existed before. They worked side by side, their actions synchronized, anticipating each other's needs without the need for words. They shared a pot of strong coffee as the sun rose fully, sitting together outside the cabin, watching the land awaken. The town might still harbor ill will, their names might be whispered with suspicion and condemnation, but that world felt distant now, its judgments less important. Their home wasn't just the cabin anymore, it was the space between them, the bond they had forged. Sahara's leg healed completely, but she did not speak of leaving again. Caleb did not suggest it. It was understood, a silent agreement reached in the shared crucible of fear and defense. Her skills with the land, her quiet strength, her deep connection to the natural world became woven into the fabric of his days. His steadiness, his quiet protection, his simple acceptance became the foundation of her new life. They were two solitary people, deemed outliers by their respective worlds, an Apache woman supposedly past her prime, a cowboy carrying the ghosts of his past. But here, in their small, isolated corner of the world, they found acceptance in each other's eyes. They built a life together, not with grand gestures or declarations, but with shared chores, quiet evenings under the stars, mutual support, and the slow, steady rhythm of two hearts beating as one. The land remained harsh, demanding, but they faced it together. It was still a life of work, of facing challenges, but it was no longer a life of profound loneliness. Sahara found a home not defined by the whispers of her community, but by the quiet presence of the man who saw her worth. Caleb found a peace he had stopped searching for, a purpose in sharing his life and his land with the woman who had brought unexpected light into his long, solitary night. They had faced prejudice and hardship, the judgment of others, and the weight of their own pasts. But through resilience, through the unexpected gift of finding each other, they had carved out a new existence, a testament to the truth that home isn't a place, but a connection, and that love and belonging can bloom in the most unlikely of circumstances, defying age, defying race, defying the narrow expectations of the world around them. Their story was a quiet echo in the vastness of the frontier, a simple truth whispered on the wind, that everyone, no matter their past or what others say, deserves to find their perfect partner, their home in another soul.